The Duke of Oakmere had answered harder questions in the House of Lords, and never won so quickly. "I never loved you," Unsay said, and the terrible part, the part he would carry the rest of his life, was that he believed it. His wife did not move. Amabel stood just inside the library door with the household book open against her arm and a candle guttering at her elbow, and for a moment the rain running along the long windows was the only sound in all of Oakmere. She had asked him plainly. That was the whole of her offence. 2 years wed, and she had come down at midnight in her grey wrapper to ask whether there might ever be, between them, anything beyond courtesy, and he had handed her the truth as he understood it, the way a man hands over a bill. "Thank you," she said. "I have wondered a great while. It is a kindness to know." He had braced for weeping the way a man braces for a horse to shy. There was none. She closed the book, set it square upon the desk with the pencil laid across it, and told him the Brewhouse account wanted his signature before Friday. Then she wished him good night, and the door made almost no sound at all. He told himself he had done well by her. His father had married for sentiment and spent 30 years teaching a wife to be frightened of him. Anselm had married for honour, a promise given to a dying man over a debt the House of Oakmere owed hers, and he had kept every article of it. She had her allowance, her rooms, her name, and he had never once raised his voice to her. He considered that a form of respect. He considered respect the higher thing. At 2:30 he heard a trunk come down the servants' stair. He stood at the window in his shirt-sleeves with the cold coming off the glass and watched the lamps of the travelling carriage swing out into the rain, past the beeches down the avenue he had learned to ride on. He did not go after her. A man did not run after a thing he had just told the truth about. That was precisely what he thought, standing there. He would remember it afterwards the way a man remembers the last words he spoke to someone at a graveside. For 11 days he would have sworn upon anything, relieved. The house was quieter, and he had wanted quiet all his life. He ate at one end of the table and read at the other, and nobody asked him whether the widow Corse had got her coals. Nobody set a sprig of anything in the blue jug on the hall table. Nobody left the schoolroom lamp burning at 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, when the tenants' girls came up the hill to be taught their letters. On the 12th day he came in from the home farm wet through, found the blue jug empty, and stood in the hall looking at it far longer than a sensible man would. He rang for Mrs. Pertwee, because it seemed a reasonable question, and asked what precisely the Duchess had done with her days. The housekeeper had been at Oakmere since before his mother died. She folded her hands in front of her apron and told him. Mondays, the sick list and the parish baskets. Tuesdays, the schoolroom. Wednesdays, the household accounts, which her Grace had kept in her own hand since the 2nd quarter of the 1st year, because old Mr. Hodderside had gone and she would not have him shamed. Thursdays, letters, pension applications for the widows of the estate, characters written for girls going out to service, the petition about the drainage at Low Marsh that had gone up to the county over his own name, because she had drafted it and laid it before him, and he had signed it without reading a line. She drafted it, Anselm said. She sat up 2 nights with the surveyor's figures, Your Grace. Mrs. Pertwee's voice did not change at all, which was worse than if it had. She said you had enough upon you. He dismissed her. Then he called her back and asked, as evenly as he could manage, whether his wife had been unhappy. She was never once unhappy where anybody could see it, said Mrs. Pertwee, which is not the same thing, if Your Grace will forgive me. He went to the estate office that evening and sent for Hodder, and had the almshouse ledger down off the shelf, because the roof at the Oakmere almshouse had been mended 2 winters ago, and he could not for the life of him recall authorizing the cost. The old steward turned the pages with a thumb and found the entry, and it said only sundries. Her Grace's own money, Hodder said, out of her pin money, quarterly, since the spring after the wedding. She asked me to enter it plain so it would not be remarked upon. Why should it not be remarked upon? Because Your Grace would have paid for it gladly, the steward said, and she did not want it to be a gift from you. She wanted the old people to have it whether or not you were fond of them. He shut the book. Awe of her. Anselm sat a long time after the man had gone. He opened the household book that night, the one she had set square on his desk with the pencil laid across it, and he found that it was not an account book at all. It was a book about people. In the margins, in a small upright hand he had seen 1,000 times on notes he never troubled to read. Course, coals and boots for the boy. Do not let her thank you, she cannot bear it. Nan Tyler's cough. Send the honey, not the money. Ask A. About the orchard wall he will say no and then do it. He always does. He read that last line 4 times. She had known him. That was the discovery, and it went through him like cold water. That this woman had studied him for 2 years the way a scholar studies a difficult text, had learned his moods and worked around his silences and understood that his refusals were only slow consents, and that he in return could not have said with certainty what color her eyes were without looking at the portrait in the gallery, which he did that night with a candle. At 2 in the morning, like a thief in his own house. Grey, they were grey. The beehives were at the foot of the south garden, 6 of them, and he found in November that nobody had taken the honey. Mrs. Pertwee said the Duchess had always done it herself and would not be helped, having a way with them. The bees, she said, never once stung her grace. Anselm was stung 4 times and got the frames out and stood in the cold with his hands smarting and understood absurdly, standing among the hives, that his house had been full of a woman for 2 years, and he had gone about it as if he lived alone. In December word came up from the village that the Duchess had taken the cottage at Netherfold, in the north, the lost small property of her mother's people, and had sent the hired carriage back, not a great house, not a friend's protection. A cottage with a green door and 11 acres, and she had gone to it alone. Mrs. Pertwee asked at the turn of the year whether the schoolroom lamp was to be lit on Tuesdays as usual. Yes, he said, it is to be lit every Tuesday. It is not to be permitted to go out. Then he stood up from the desk and rang and told them to have the grey saddled at first light. I am going north, said the Duke of Oakmere. Netherfold in January was a grey village in a grey fold of the hills, and the cottage with the green door had smoke coming out of it, and a goat in the orchard and washing frozen stiff on a line. Amabel opened the door herself with flour to the wrist. She looked at him for perhaps 2 seconds, and then she said, You had better come in before you let the heat out. There was no fine room to receive him in. He sat at her kitchen table under a row of drying herbs with his hat on his knee like a curate, and she made tea and set it before him in a cup that did not match its saucer, and he laid out everything he had come 200 miles to say. He said her position was irregular and that people talked, and he would not have her spoken of. He said that Oakmere wanted a mistress and the schoolroom was not the same without her. He said he had brought papers from his attorney, that her allowance would be doubled, that the whole east front could be given to her use, and that he would undertake upon his honour never to trouble her. Amabel listened to the whole of it without interrupting once, which was, he realized afterwards, the most damning courtesy anybody had ever shown him. No, she said, he had not, in 39 years, been refused anything by anybody. You have come a long way, she said gently, to offer me the same house on better terms. I did not leave because the terms were poor, Anselm. I left because you told me the truth, and the truth was that I had spent 2 years loving a man who did not know I was in the room. I am not angry. I have never once been angry with you, but I am not going back to be furniture in a warmer wing, he said with the last of his pride, that he had never lied to her. No, she agreed. That is the trouble. I could have forgiven a lie. She took up his cup, which he had not touched, and set it in the basin. I am well here. I have the bees I brought, and the garden, and the school at Netherfold on Thursdays, and I sleep. Please do not come again to persuade me. It is very cold, and you will want to be off before the light goes. He rode back south through 3 days of sleet, and somewhere on the 2nd day, on an empty road under a white sky, the thing he had been holding off with both hands came down on him. He had not lost her in January. He had lost her at midnight in his own library, and he had stood at the glass and watched it happen and called it honesty. He did not write to her that week, nor the next. A letter just then would have been one more thing done for his own relief and dressed up as consideration, and he had done enough of that. Instead he went and looked at his life as a man looks at a neglected farm. He read the household book from the first page to the last, and then went out and met the people in it. He learned that Nan Tyler's cough was worse in a wet spring, and that the honey was better than the money. He sat 2 hours with Old Course's widow and let her talk about her boy, and never once looked at his watch. He took the drainage at Low Marsh to the county himself, and argued it for 40 minutes in a cold room, and when they granted it he went out into the yard wanting very badly to tell somebody, and had nobody to tell. He endowed the school. Not in her name, because that would have been a demand dressed as a tribute, but properly and in perpetuity, with a mistress paid a decent wage, and on Tuesdays he went up himself and heard the girls read. In March he began to write, not persuasions. He sent her the news of the estate as she would have wanted it, that the orchard wall was down after all, and he had had it rebuilt without being asked twice, that the bees had come through the winter, 5 of the 6, that he had been stung again and had concluded it was a matter of temperament and not of technique. He wrote that the blue jug in the hall stood empty, and that he had not had the presumption to fill it. He asked for nothing at the foot of any of them. She did not answer for 2 months. Then in May there came 4 lines in the small upright hand, that the hive which failed would have been the one nearest the wall, which was always damp and should be moved, that Mrs. Pertwee's niece ought to be trained up before somebody else took her, that the blue jug wanted water and not presumption. She signed herself Amabel and nothing else. He carried it in his coat for a fortnight. They wrote all that summer and into the autumn, and the letters grew longer, and somewhere in them a man he did not entirely recognize began to say true things without being asked, that he had been taught to mistake feeling for weakness by a father who had been cruel in a quiet voice, that he had honestly believed giving a woman everything except himself was generosity, that he had lain awake in November counting the times she had come into a room, and he had not looked up. In October she wrote, "You are learning to say a great deal on paper. I wonder whether you can say any of it out of doors." He went north again in the last week of that month, and this time he brought no attorney's papers, no settlement, no arguments about the county. He brought nothing at all, which took more courage than the rest of it together. She was in the orchard with the goat and a basket. She straightened when she saw him at the gate, and for a while neither of them said anything. "When I told you I had never loved you," Anselm said, "it was the truest thing I knew, and the last true thing I said for a year. I did not know the word for what I felt when you came into a room. I thought it was habit. I have had a great deal of time to consider it since, and I find I've loved you since the 2nd winter, and likely before, and I did not know it because nobody in my father's house ever named such a thing aloud." His hands were shaking, and he let them. "I have not come to persuade you. I have come because you asked whether I could say it out of doors." Amabel set the basket down in the wet grass. "Say the rest of it," she said, not unkindly, not mistaken. "Wrong, wrong. You were not furniture in any wing of any house of mine. You were the whole of what made it a house. And I would sooner live at Netherfold with a goat than at Oakmere without you." She laughed at that, unsteadily, with her hand over her mouth, and then she was crying, and he crossed the orchard and did not touch her until she put her hand out first. She came home in her own time and not in his. It was December before she consented and February before she came, and she came upon terms she wrote out herself in the small upright hand, which he signed at the bottom without amending a word, that the accounts remained hers, that the school was hers, that he would tell her the truth always, and would take the trouble first to find out what it was. The blue jug in the hall was full the day she came, with holly, because it was February and there was nothing else. He was stung twice more that summer, taking the honey with her at the foot of the south garden, and she laughed at him with her sleeves pushed up and the veil pushed back off her grey eyes, and the Duke of Oakmere stood among his wife's bees with his hands smarting, and thought that a man might be given his whole lifer again, if he were fortunate, and had the sense not to spend the second one as he had spent the first.